Hi everyone, can you hear me okay?
Yeah.
Yeah, good. So thanks for inviting me to speak this afternoon. Bit of a change of topic. I have a company called UK Hempcrete. We're based just down the road from here in the Derbyshire Dales. I'm here today to tell you about some training that we've developed over the last sort of 18 months, which is training people within the construction industry to use bio-based insulation products mainly when retrofitting older properties. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about that. But for those of you who don't know us, UK Hempcrete started life as a very specialist, very small specialist contractor building things from a material called hempcrete, which is basically the stalk of the industrial hemp plant mixed with a building lime binder, and that's used to provide insulating solid walls in new build, and it can also be applied to existing buildings to add insulation. Okay, and then over the years, we've 10 years ago, 11 years ago, wrote a book called the Hempcrete Book, telling everybody how to build with hempcrete. And then that has kind of led us down a sort of pivot towards education and consulting and teaching other people in the industry how to use not just hempcrete, but other bio-based materials in construction. Okay, so there's a wide palette of materials, but what they all have in common is that they all start their life as plants. So during the growing phase, they absorb CO2 from the atmosphere through photosynthesis. They store that in the fibers of the plant, and then we harvest that biomass and we turn it into construction products, and we lock it away in buildings for the lifetime of that building or that insulation. So over the years, we have started supplying those materials that we've been using on site for the last couple of decades. We have a specialist architectural design practice in-house where we design bio-based building envelopes and assist other architects in doing the same. We do building performance modelling, specifically looking at bio-based materials, because the way that bio-based materials differ from conventional building products is that because they started life as living organisms that, like you and me, are 80% water, the fibers of those plants are vapor permeable, they're hygroscopic, they will absorb moisture and release it again. So that's quite different from a lot of conventional construction materials, and that's key to why we would use them in retrofit, actually. So, and then more recently, we have developed a specific service around retrofit. We specialize in the retrofit of what we call traditionally constructed buildings. So that would include certainly anything before the First World War, and a great proportion of interwar buildings, if we're thinking about housing anyway. And what those buildings have in common is that they're built with solid walls. I'm sure some of you probably live in a house that looks a bit like this in Sheffield. They're built with solid walls, they're built with lime mortars, lime plasters, so they have building fabric which is vapor permeable. Okay, and we provide a specialist retrofit assessment and design service for social landlords, private individuals, landlords, whoever, really. So I don't know how many people have, in fact, put your hands up if you've thought about retrofitting buildings. That would be quite interesting, because I don't. Okay. Well, I know you have. So one. Okay, that's not many of you. All right. It might be because, you just maybe you don't own a building that needs retrofitting for a start. But put your hands up if you thought about the climate crisis. Okay, right, okay. So the UK construction industry contributes about 7% to our total GDP as a country. And the UK built environment and the construction demolition industry contributes about 52% of our total carbon emissions as a country, and about 60% of our waste as a country. So I think it's quite interesting that only one hand went up to thinking about retrofit, but everybody's hand went up to about the climate crisis. Because I think mostly when, and I try this out on trains all the time, but mostly when you're talking to someone about the climate emergency, they're thinking EVs, they're thinking solar panels, but the kind of elephant in the room really is, out of that 52% of UK carbon emissions, about half of that is poorly constructed buildings using too much fuel to heat or cool them because they're not efficient, and the other half is the embodied carbon in the materials that we use to construct buildings. So that's extraction of raw materials, manufacture, etc., etc. So if we don't do something about the construction industry, then it doesn't really matter what else we do, quite frankly. So within the UK, we've got about 28, 29 million buildings to retrofit, by which I mean add insulation and upgrade that building to something like a modern standard of thermal efficiency. Okay, and we need to do all of this work very quickly to meet our 2050 climate emission reduction targets. There's a huge job to do, which is a huge challenge, but also a huge opportunity for people who work in my industry. It's worth pointing out that we don't build a huge amount of buildings in this country, consistently fail to meet the targets of new housing that we need to be building. But everything we are building will also need retrofitting, because today's building regulations are not requiring us to build to a standard that will keep buildings cool in 20, 30 years' time within the changing context of a changing climate. So that's quite depressing. And out of that huge stock of homes that need retrofitting, about 1/3 of those are traditionally constructed buildings, which, as I said, means solid walls, generally known for being cold, inefficient, harder to heat, sometimes unfairly so. So why is it important then that we take that, well, just 8 million or whatever it is, traditionally constructed buildings, why is it important that we retrofit them using bio-based insulations? So I've already alluded to the fact that the original building fabric was built with materials that are open to moisture vapor, okay? And that was not intentional, that was just because prior to the sort of 1920s, that's what people had. In fact, prior to 1850 in this country, there was no sort of manufacturing of construction materials, there was no scale transport, so you were using local, natural, bio-based materials essentially to build with. If we don't use vapor permeable materials when we're retrofitting these older buildings, then various things can happen. So number one, we can cause damage to the building fabric itself. So there's quite an extreme example of a brick wall that was originally built with lime mortar, which is vapor permeable, and it's been repointed using cement mortar. And the idea of mortar is that any moisture that gets absorbed into the brick can always leave through the mortar, which should be softer than the masonry around it. So that water should keep leaving through the pointing mortar. Eventually that mortar will degrade and it'll need redoing. But if you use a hard cement mortar, then that basically stops the moisture leaving and it holds it in the brick. The brick stays wet, and then when in the winter, when the temperature drops, the water in the brick freezes and blows the face off the brick. Okay, so generally not good for our old buildings to be to have materials that are not vapor permeable used, but also not really good for the occupants of the buildings. So here's a traditional stone building, traditional building that's been repaired and upgraded over the years. So it's had probably the pointing needed redoing on the outside. But actually, probably what happened first is the floor inside the building, which was probably quarry tiles on bare earth, and historically would have moisture moving up and down through the floor. Someone came in the 1960s, 70s and said, look now, come on mother, you can't be living in this old Victorian house. We need to kind of put a nice modern floor in, so we'll put a plastic membrane all over, no insulation because we haven't had the oil crisis yet, but we'll put a cement screed in and we'll make it so that moisture can't come up and down through the floor. Okay, so the floor is now nice and dry, but where does that moisture, which is still in the ground, where does that go? It goes into the only bit of the building where there isn't a plastic membrane, which is the dry walls. Okay, and it soaks up the walls. So now we're getting some damp showing on the walls, on the plasterwork inside. So probably what we're going to do is knock some plaster off and re-plaster with a modern plaster, and we might use a kind of paint, hopefully not nowadays, but certainly in the past we might have used an acrylic-based paint, and that will kind of trap moisture within the wall. And a wet wall is a cold wall, okay? Because what we think of as a solid wall has actually got lots of air pockets inside it, and as moisture wicks up inside the wall, those air pockets that are actually providing insulation get filled with water. Water is a much faster conductor of heat than air is, and so a damp wall is a cold wall. So the occupants inside the house are getting cold quicker than they would have done. There's also the ideal conditions for mold to start growing on the inside the wall and on the surfaces of the wall, because it's much damper than it would have been otherwise. The pointing probably needs doing outside. Lots of water is trying to leave the wall to the outside through that line pointing. But instead of repointing it, what they've done is gone, well, it always seems wet, this wall. Let's do a cement render, and that will keep the weather out. So they've cement rendered the outside of the building, which again is an impermeable layer, which is just trapping that moisture inside the wall. Okay, so the same wall properly maintained and the same building properly maintained would be people making the choice to use vapor permeable materials. There will still be some moisture coming up from the floor, because that's how, there was no damp proof, of course, that's how the building was built. But if we use appropriate materials, then that moisture can leave and be vented away, instead of staying in the fabric to damage the building and potentially the health of the occupants. So here's another brick wall, Victorian house. So this is the conventional approach, okay? So we want to reduce the energy bills, we want to improve the thermal comfort of the occupants. So the construction industry would normally take special plasterboard that's got 50 mil of PIR insulation on the back. Do you know what PIR insulation is? Polyisocyanurate. It's a petrochemical foam product. You probably know it by its brand name of Kingspan. It's one of the insulations that was used at Grenfell, okay, and it is a closed cell foam insulation, so it traps air well, and it provides a good layer of insulation, but it is completely impermeable to water. Also gives off hydrogen cyanide when it's burnt, which is what was the cause of death for most of the people at Grenfell. So there are reasons why you might not want to use it in your living space, but that's the typical approach. But the problem is, what happens then is that gets stuck to the inside of the walls and it gets replastered, but then any moisture coming into those walls from the ground, for example, or from rain outside, gets trapped and can't leave, and with all of those problems that we've just talked about. So an alternative would be to use something like a rigid wood fibre board. So this is recycled timber, which is again made into a rigid insulation board, gets fixed to the walls, has a lime plaster applied over the top of the board, and that leaves the whole wall vapor permeable and doesn't interrupt moisture. There's a picture of some hemp for Iris. So there's a whole range of different products that we have available. This is literally just a handful of them. So we have hemp that's grown locally in the UK. We have wood fibre. We have cork. Cork isn't grown locally in the UK, but cork-based lime plaster to make it an insulating plaster. And various types of natural fibre insulations from hemp fibre, recycled timber fibre, jute, sheep's wool, etc. So this is what we've been doing in our practice over the last few years. And we recently teamed up with an organisation called Nottingham Energy Partnership, who are a climate action charity based in Nottingham, as you can imagine, to develop some specific training about how to use these materials in retrofit. Because as I said, the conventional construction industry is sticking petrochemical foam to buildings, damaging the building, creating the conditions for black mold, which in some cases can be toxic, and therefore damaging the health of occupants. So Nottingham Energy Partnership they've had a kind of £4.5 million lottery grant to work with an estate in Nottingham called the Meadows, which is a housing estate near the centre of town. And they've been working with that estate on their response to the climate crisis. A lot of what needs doing is retrofitting of buildings, and about 50% of the Meadows is kind of 1980s, 90s maisonette housing, and the other 50% is Victorian conservation area, not very well conserved conservation area. And of that, about 20% is housing associations and 80% is private landlords, but it's the kind of private landlords where they own a whole street kind of thing, and they're a little bit difficult to engage with. And so what they discovered was that actually within their sort of contractor base in the area, there wasn't really any knowledge of these materials and how they should be using it. So they suggested that we partner up and write some training. We got some funding from the Energy Industry Voluntary Redress Scheme, which is a pot of funding where it's like the swear box for energy companies. So when they do something bad, they have to chuck a few £100,000 in the fund for doing good stuff. So we got some funding from there to develop the training and to deliver it as a pilot to 30 people in Nottingham. And so that's what we did. We developed these materials. So all of the pictures, the illustrations you've seen today are from the training materials. This is a small view of, we built a lot of rigs. So we had the corner of a Victorian house mocked up. We had a roof that we could insulate. We had a floor so that we could insulate a suspended timber floor, and we could also do a floor screen. We sort of wrote a course that was sort of 50% classroom and 50% practical introduction to the application of these materials within, within the context of retrofit. So that's the floor screeding. This is an insulated lime, so it's a lime sand screed, and then with a recycled foamed glass underneath. This is hempcrete being installed. On the left, you can see hempcrete being mixed on site and cast in formwork up against the wall of the house. And on the right, obviously, precast hempcrete blocks. So these photos were all from the pilot, and what we did was we were quite targeted in who we went after to come on the pilot. They were fully funded places. So we targeted homeowners, we targeted contractors in the area, we targeted local authority employees. So we had conservation officers come on the course, including the county conservation officer, which we're very happy about. We had people from environmental health come on the course because they were the people who are dealing with damp and mould and poor housing. So that's where we're at. We've delivered the pilot twice, and then from that, we've taken what we'd written as a level 2 course and we've kind of not rewritten it, but we've reorganized some of the material, and we now have 3 different routes through the material. So we've got a level 2, which is more practical, a level 3, which is theory based, and then a level 3, which is practical as well, because actually those consultant type people, the conservation officers, the consultants, they want to be hands-on with the materials because they're the ones that are having to specify it and ask builders to do it, but they don't have the confidence in what they're asking them to do because they haven't used it themselves. So that's it. If you want to find out more about it, if you're interested in it, then it's not going to go back for me. Then I've skipped over the slide with the thing on, but if you Google conservation retrofit, the website for the course will come up and you can find out. All right.
Right, last but not least, we've got Lauren. Thanks, Lauren. That was really